All right, guys. This is probably one of my favorite episodes we get to record every year for a couple reasons. One, because when you see the report card episode drop, you know we're in the week before the playoffs. And that is exciting in itself. And also, I think it's a lot of fun to kind of dissect and go through what for us Celtics fans was a phenomenal year. Really, they, in my opinion, they met expectations and maybe even exceeded some. So, if you're new here to the Celtics Talk Weekly podcast, because we got a lot of new listeners and followers since last year, this is simply we go through pretty much every single player and we're gonna give them our grade. And I'm excited to see what you guys have to say. Players and coaches as well. We're gonna talk about the staff, Joe Mazzulla. Xavier, I know you're excited for that because
Pumped.
because this should be fun. But guys, let's not even waste any time. Let's get right into it. We got a lot to talk about, man. The first one up, let's start with the superstar himself, man. Jason Tatum. Now, I think Tatum here is going to be an interesting one because it's hard to grade him because you want to give him the A+ and you don't want to be harsh on him because he doesn't deserve really that. But I'll start us off with an A-. I'm giving JT an A- because I was thinking about it. An A+ doesn't seem fair because I think there were some positive and negatives in this game. The positives, in my opinion, offensive playmaking just exceeded expectations, and we saw tremendous growth with JT this year. I thought his offensive role, he did a phenomenal job setting himself up in the offense and not really forcing himself, and he incorporated himself really well into this new offense. Some negatives I have for him, he was a streaky shooter kind of all year long, which we're used to seeing with JT, but I felt like a little bit more so this year. And I thought he settled a lot on the offensive side of the ball. And then defensively, I think he was really locked in on the games that mattered, but some of those dog days games, he had a couple defensive mislaps. So for JT, I'm giving him an A-.
I thought I was going to be the tough critic here and the strict professor that everyone hated in the class. But I went with the same grade as you, Rob. Almost on the same points. I just don't think Tatum had that A+ season, that MVP season that he was so hoping for. I think he was too focused on trying to be the best when it kind of got in his way, in his own way sometimes. Sometimes he was trying to take shots that he can make, but genuinely there are wiser decisions he could have made on the court. I will say his ball movement and playmaking, his ability to play with teammates has improved greatly over the past year. He seems very comfortable playing alongside the other four that are with him, and I think that we did a very solid job of getting a great base around Jason Tatum to do this. But I think that what he needs is to kind of figure out how to get into that dog mentality. There were a few performances this season that he was able to take over the game, but there wasn't one that was a him performance just yet.
Outside of that, I think the Minnesota game was kind of the only game we saw.
Yeah, that was, and that was early on in the season, and there were also opportunities to have those types of games. Obviously, you're not going to be able to rise to the occasion every time, but there were a few other opportunities he had that would have made a better discussion for him to get a higher grade in this year's report card.
I feel like I was listening to Perk at the end of that. Let's make it triple, though. Yeah, I also have an A-, and I want to preface this with I'm a very tough grader, and a lot of these grades are not going to be what people want them to be. But I agree that Tatum was an A-. And to be honest with you, I think I would have had an A for him about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I understand the Celtics have had nothing to play for as of late, but his energy is still a little annoying sometimes. And like I said, I've defended for a few weeks now the fact that when you have nothing to play for, you can't really try that hard. And I do grasp that. However, I just wanted to see a little bit more Tatum at the end of the season because, again, they have not done anything technically yet. 64 wins is awesome. And to have one of the best seasons of recent franchise history, should be celebrated. But again, nothing matters unless you win that title. And I think with Tatum, the beginning of the season, Rob kind of touched upon it. His shooting splits were terrible from deep. He was settling way too much. He was shooting like 28% on step back threes and whatnot, threes off the dribble. And his catch and shoot was just miles above, and he wasn't doing it nearly as much. And then over Christmas, Mr. Hamlin, Drew Hamlin, kind of helped his game out a little bit. And it really looked like that his three-pointer was back. And then towards the end of the season, it started to go sideways again. He was settling again, and the splits weren't nearly as great. And I think with Tatum is the big thing that I look for when watching him is, does he have it within the first 5 minutes? And as stupid as it sounds, I swear you can tell how good a Tatum game is going to be in the first 5 minutes. Is he playing hard? Is he closing out hard? How does he look? Is he complaining every 2 seconds to the ref? Not that that's an indicator anymore because he does it every single game. But regardless, I think his sacrifice was admirable. I don't think he sacrificed nearly as much as others on the team, but he still did. I think he's a borderline first-team All-NBA guy. We're going to see it's basically him and Brunson. We're going to see who gets that split. But, again, I think Tatum had a good season, but I don't think it was nearly as good of a building block season as the seasons prior. I don't think that's concerning because, again, the talent around him, I think, played a part into that. But if you're a Celtics fan and you have aspirations for this guy who you think could be a top 3, top 2 player in the league one day, he doesn't necessarily build off his last few seasons, it's a little concerning. But I don't think it's going down to like a B or anything like that. I think A- is fine because I think with Tatum, the thing I look for also, not as many guys as him in the top 10 in the NBA look like an A+ or a B- night in and night out, quite like Jason Tatum.
Right.
It's just a little inconsistent at times. It never bottoms out like it used to, but there's some nights that are a little concerning, especially against some of the top tier teams in the NBA. But yeah, I thought he had a solid season.
And I think a reason for you say not bottoming out, I think it's that playmaking improvement that you've seen, that he can be shooting 7 of 27 and his impact is still felt and his presence is still in running. He's still running the game. So yeah, I think when you look at JT, it could have been an A for me but when you think about it, expectations, what we thought was going to happen coming to this year didn't really happen with him. However, he's the best player on the best team in the NBA, and you can't really take that away from him. So moving on here, though, guys, Jaylen Brown's up next. And this one, to me, was the no-brainer, easiest grade I put on my sheet because I instantly threw down an A+. Because Jaylen Brown, to me this year, was by far the most impressive. The fact to me that he just got paid, he's not in a contract year, he just got paid, and his improvement was just tremendous. His playmaking took a big leap. His offensive efficiency took a big leap. His defensive anchor and his defensive performance took a big leap. The only negative I really had on JB this year was his streaky shooting at times, but at the same time, he's a volume scorer. So that's going to happen with those volume scorers is you're going to get nights where it's not falling. So for me, JB, I think defensively, he was the dog on this team. And then offensively, he's continued to set the tone night in and after night. Really, really impressive year from Jaylen Brown, in my opinion. And that is why I had to give him an A+.
Yeah, I was just below you. I didn't hand out any A+s this year.
Wow, Barry in the lead.
I'm just gonna let out a spoiler. I'm not handing out an A+ until Banner 18. But Jaylen Brown got the highest grade of an A.
Okay.
I think Jaylen Brown has really stepped up in that captain role for the team. He's taken over when Jason Tatum has had those off nights. He's the one that kind of puts in that effort when Jason Tatum's not doing as much of it and going on those freaky shooting slopes. And he seems like the one that wants to get into the paint first. That's almost the biggest clear indicator of who's going to have the bigger night of Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown, who's going to get to the paint first. And that's whoever gets there takes over the game. I think what Jaylen Brown has been able to do on the defensive side has shown a lot of hustle. His on-ball defense has stepped up immensely from last year. He's started to really take the leadership role, and that's what's expected when you are paid $300 million.
Remind me not to be enrolled in Franco's class. I think the thing with JB is, I'll give the grade at the end with this. So here's the good. His defense has been phenomenal. His on-ball defense has always been solid. Last year, it took a serious dip, but this year it really came back up. But my thing with Jaylen Brown was his mental lapses off ball were terrible for a long time. Few players got backdoor cutted as much as Jaylen Brown did. And that's stirred up as part of his game this year. And it's been great to see. He has truly been one of the top 20 defenders in all of basketball. Offensively, he does score in volume. He's a volume scorer. His efficiency is actually pretty good for a guy that does it like him. And I think his offensive game has expanded. He's playing better around the rim. The numbers aren't really much different, but from an eye test wise, he just looks more comfortable. You feel more comfortable. It's more like within a structure as far as he's not just diving to the basket like he used to and just throwing stuff off the top of the backboard. It's much more in control. But, and here's the big but, and I feel like no one wants to talk about this, but I'll be the one to bring it up. When this team's offense struggles, it struggles because of the lack of ball movement, and not a single player on this team is a bigger offender than Jaylen Brown. Not a single one. And as great as Jaylen Brown's been, he dribbles the air out of the basketball sometimes at the end of games. Worse than Jason Tatum. Worse than few players in this league. And it's all about him. And for a guy that has sacrificed so much in the beginning of the season, he was seriously probably sacrificing more than even Drew Holiday was. For a guy that really put his pride aside after he got paid, late in games, he still wants it to be the Jaylen Brown show. And that's cause for concern for a team that struggles late in games, for a team that blows leads late in games. So for that, I'm going to give him an A. And it felt a little high, but I feel like because of what he put aside, his ego and whatnot, and the defensive intensity he brought, which is such a valuable part of this team at different points in the season, I bumped him up a little bit to an A. But I feel like that point about him just struggling late in games doesn't get talked about enough between Celtics fans and in the media, and I feel like it should, because everyone wants to point to Jason Tatum, and I understand that. I'm not saying he's a saint late in games either, but I see much more growth, and I see much more ability to flip a switch in Jason Tatum than I do in Jaylen Brown.
I think that's fair. And I will say this, you're going to want to take my class then, guys, because I got a couple more A pluses to hand out, and I won't lie to you. But next up, let's run Kristaps Porzingis.
This was my toughest player to grade, Rob.
Yeah, it was rough because his impact was so huge to this team that it felt like even if he had a down year, he was still going to nail an A for me. And it's just, you see the growth in Brown and Tatum and White and, even the bench guys. It really all circulates from Kristaps Porzingis in bringing him in. So for me, I give Kristaps an A, a straight A. And the reason being for that is because how dominant offensively he was for us. And I think defensively, you look at the second half of the year and his numbers just blow the first half of the year out of the water. And I really think offensively and defensively, when you put him in a vacuum, he had probably the biggest impact on this team. And, I will say he is the ultimate mismatch. And guys, you want to talk about why he's so high for me, why Kristaps Porzingis is an A? The vibes that this man brought into Boston and brought to this team, you had never seen out of Kristaps Porzingis before. He was kind of always a complainy, head down type of player, right? No one really saw this side of KP before, this fun, happy, nice, goofy guy that he has grown to be. And quite frankly, you look at the situations he was in, he went from a terrible getting booed on a draft night in New York, right, into a Luka Doncic show in Dallas, and then Washington, who wants to be in Washington right now? And then he comes to Boston, which is like this breath of fresh air for him. So for me, the biggest reason for his A is the vibes he brought. He was you could tell the players loved him. The fans loved him. He loved the players. He loved the fans. I will say the reason why he's not an A plus, I thought he settled, which is kind of a common trend for some of these guys, a lot in big games from behind the arc. I thought that he sometimes steered away from what worked, which was the ultimate mismatch that he is in the post. However, Kristaps, phenomenal regular season. I got to give him an A.
Yeah, it went just below there around an A-. I think that he had a phenomenal year and went beyond what his expectations were. I give him an A-, and I think mainly because of the fact that he hasn't been out for an extensive amount of time due to an injury yet. And that's a credit to the Boston Celtics time management, being able to rotate him out, getting him those off nights that he needed on back-to-backs. But he almost fit in seamlessly. He answered any defensive questions he had about him going into the season, which was, would he be a liability? Can he man down the middle? Which we've seen he answered he can, and I think his IQ on the defensive block has improved. Would love to see more intensity down low, especially if we're matching up against players like Embiid and Giannis during the playoffs if we run into them. And I think that he could be a major anchor going forward for the Celtics, and I think he's solidified his role with the team for years to come.
For me, he was like an 89.56, so I'll give him an A-, but he was right there on the B+ A- border for me. Here's the thing. When he first came to the team, the first half of the season, he was borderline an all-star. The only reason, in my opinion, he probably wasn't because games played, but he was that impactful. Defensively, around the block, he was incredible. He was blocking shots left and right. He was a real deterrent down there. On the offensive end, he was an absolute weapon as well. His post-up game was probably only second to Jokic as far as efficiency-wise was concerned. His passing out of there was also awesome. He was so committed to fitting in this team and being that X factor down low. And then all of a sudden, it just kind of went away. And we talked about it numerous times. He started to just become glorified Ryan Anderson. He was just running around the three-point line, hucking up threes. And that's awesome. That's great. He still had some great games doing that. But what really set him apart was him being able to anchor on the block and get those freebies, especially when things broke down. The Celtics didn't really have that go-to guy, that go-to play to work to, because Tatum and Brown's go-to plays were these fadeaway jumpers that aren't as efficient as, let's say, a Kristaps catch and post-up.
Right.
And as soon as they started to get away from that, I feel like the team didn't necessarily hurt in the win column. Obviously, they have 64 wins. But the offense just didn't look as unstoppable as it did in the first half of the season. And I feel like the last few weeks they've kind of gone back to it a little bit more and a little bit more. And Joe Maz is big on this, we're saving it for the playoffs mentality, and we'll get to him later. But I think just watching Kristaps, I thought it was going to be one thing watching the first half of the season, and then it became something else for a majority of that second half. And even if it's in the middle, he's still an A guy, but we need it to be in the middle. We can't have him just become this spot-up three-point shooter. It doesn't really work like that for this team. I know some people in the coaching staff want it to, but it doesn't. And I think for me, that's why he was an A-, because that impact on the court that was so immense to start the season waned and waned and waned and became less valuable. Because I'm sure you guys remember when he was missing those early games, it was like the team didn't know what to do because he was such a weapon. It was like anytime something bad happened, give KP the ball. And that's why they dropped some games early, because they didn't have that luxury. And I'm glad they figured out how to play without him, because his health is a luxury in itself. But at the same time, they need to use him for what he's best at. So for me, he was an A-. And I think it's a shame, because I think this was a guy that Rob talked about. His vibes were incredible. Right. Always smiling. Everyone seems to like him. He has this awesome relationship with Jaylen Brown and some of the other guys in the team. It felt like everything was lined up for, if he was healthy, to be an A+. And it's a little disappointing to me that he wasn't a little more impactful as the season goes along. But I feel like perhaps they were saving him for the playoffs, and I don't want to overreact too much to it.
Right. I think there's no doubt about it that they were managing him all year. But it was smart, though. He didn't really miss an extended period of time, I don't think. I mean, maybe.
No, not really.
like 4 games, I think was the max we saw him miss from that like weird ankle injury he had there. Moving on though. This one I think to me might have been the easiest. Outside of Jaylen Brown, it was up there though. Derek White. I want to talk about D White because he's an interesting one. Because he had this just absurd run in like January through kind of fizzled out in February. And then he kind of hit this cold spot right before the All-Star break, and then he kind of picked it back up post All-Star break. I I gave him an A+, which again, but for me, this one feels right because Derek White's clutch time numbers, guys, are ridiculous. He is shooting over 55% from the floor and behind the arc in the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter. He is in like the top 5 percentile of that stat. He is one of the best clutch time players in the NBA. His defensive switchability, he is the league leader in blocks for guards, and he can really somehow guard 1 through 5 on a switch if he needs to. And I really think that his role this year was what it should have been last year. What that Brogdon and Smart were kind of holding him back. I gave him an A+. I will say, I think Derek White, it could have been an A. It could have, because of how much he settles. Again, he settles a lot, and particularly on the fast break, I have noticed this year, where it feels like Boston has a 2-on-1 play at the rim, and all of a sudden it's a
terrible
Derek White 3. And again, for me though, when you put Derek White's season in a vacuum, it was an A+. I thought the fact that he even put his name into the All-Star campaign and the respect he got, he's an all defensive first team in my opinion. I mean, D White was tremendous for us.
The amount of improvement and the fact that he was able to withhold the momentum he had from the playoffs last year into this year, being able to fill into that larger role that the Celtics felt confident with them having, being the starting shooting guard alongside Holiday. I gave him a A-. I think that he had a very consistent year up until that little skid and then the complacency, but he was one of the players that you always saw bringing it on a night-to-night basis. It was almost every time that you would watch a fast break, he was the one in the paint, giving that hustle play, giving that ridiculous block on the other side of the court against a much larger player that he has absolutely no business being in the air with. I think that he has grown into that role player, and I think having him being able to be that spark and have those nights where he can have 35 points is a major weapon that the Celtics will unlock during playoffs. But I think you know what you're going to get out of Derek White. There's not very nights that you are too disappointed to have him on the court.
Yeah, when he first came to Boston, he looked scared of the ball. And I remember during that finals run, they were just begging for him to be a little more confident, and it just didn't seem like he could do that. And this year's confidence just grew leaps and bounds, and his ability to put the ball on the floor and be another creator has really taken this team up a notch. It's a critical reason why this team has 64 wins that I don't think enough people talk about, is the fact that you have 4 guys who can consistently put the ball on the floor, get their own shot whenever they really want to. And they do it all in different ways, but I think White's the most interesting one because if you watched him in San Antonio, you never really thought he'd be this version of this guy. You knew he had the intangibles. There was always a point where you can maybe think that this guy could be an ultimate glue guy, an ultimate role player, like just high-end Bruce Brown kind of guy. But I think he's exceeded even that. And I think that's what's been impressive to me. And like Rob said, he did have all-star buzz, and I think a lot of it was the Boston media machine just really pushing it and how great Boston's record was at the beginning of the season. But I think a lot of it was deserved too, because his defensive impact is undoubtable. You've never seen a guard block like Derek White, not in modern day, not for someone like me who's 22 years old. I've never seen anything like it. And for him to be able to protect the rim at his size is also so valuable. He's an underrated rebounder. He's scrappy. He's a great guy to have on the team. I think too much, like Rob said, he gets a little overconfident now, which I can't believe I'm saying 2 years
Right.
after that finals run where it looked like he just did not want the ball in his hands whatsoever at any point. I think the fast break stuff is a little worrisome. I think too often he has a lane to the basket and he telegraphs a kick out. But that's really nitpicky. I'm gonna go A. The only reason I'm gonna say it was an A plus is because the first half was clearly better than the second half. It wasn't sustained throughout the entire year. But I think even then, the fact they're getting this set of Derek White is truly unbelievable. And he's just one of those guys. Like, he's my favorite non-Jason Tatum player on this team. Like, he's just a guy that brings in the arena. He gets the crowd going. He's an underrated, like, just figure that everyone can kind of look up to on this team. He usually does the right thing. And I think those guys, especially on a team vying for a title that already has a superstar nucleus in the Jays, is so much needed. And I've really loved his season. He, to me, had the second best season from like a player up per player basis. And we'll get to who I think had the best later.
Next up is the hardest write-in for me. The hardest
Really?
report card. Yes, because it was such a weird year for Drew Holiday. It was so not Drew Holiday. Which is why my grade for him is uber high, I think. But the sacrifice that he did this year was just wild when you think about it. He is coming off of the second best player on the championship team. The second best player on a 1 seed in the Eastern Conference. And again, like I said, the second best player on a championship team that just won the title 3 years ago. I mean, Drew Holiday is not a role player in any world, nor should he be. Yet he has found himself in this role player situation for the Boston Celtics. That, to me, is why he's an A+. It's my last A+ of the video or of the
What
podcast.
school do you, if I would be able to go to college if I went to your school, Rob?
I will say, but it felt like I couldn't, anything lower felt wrong to me because of, you couldn't see many players in the NBA make the switch like that and have it look so natural and not hear a peep and be so okay about it than what you saw out of Drew Holiday this year. His defensive free safety role that he's been playing for us, guys, and you really have to look for it to notice it. But if you're looking for it, he is roaming. He's not really guarding anyone ever, unless it's on ball. When he's off ball, he is our free safety, and he just eats up the lanes. He just clogs it, and it was phenomenal what he did for us. To me, it was the best role player in the NBA, and the best role player in the NBA deserves an A+.
The comparison that I've thought of throughout the season is Drew Holiday is Marcus Smart without trying. I
What
think
Marcus Smart should have been is what Drew
Yeah.
Holiday is.
Yeah, like if Marcus Smart, I think Marcus Smart was way too go for that moment and try to get that big jump on the ball. I think Holiday is a much smarter player than Marcus is, and I think that's why his IQ has brought this team through the roof. And I think that he can have those quiet nights and not get recognized for it just because it's so nonchalant and much more in between the details when Marcus Smart was just more willing to do something that someone else wasn't willing to do. I think I gave Drew Holiday a B+ for this year. I think
Ooh. I'm not going to your school. No way. No
Is
way.
it Harvard?
Unenrolling.
it's like a 89 though. It's like a 89.9. Maybe if Drew Holiday came and saw the professor, he would be able to get up to that A-.
Can I ask you something, Franco?
Yeah.
What separated you from a B+ and an A, like in that A area? What was the deciding factor?
I think that he was just a little more. I think he kind of sacrificed a little more than he needed to. I think he could have
Too
had
complacent. That's fair.
Yeah. Well, I think he could have had a much more louder year than he did, and I think that he almost was kind of scared of taking up too much of a role here. I
Right.
think that he would have felt like he was stepping on shoes if he was starting to go into those higher field goal nights, and that's something that I don't want him to be afraid of during the playoffs. And the reason I like my grades being so low right now is because when we get back to this after the postseason and we do another report card,
Right.
I'll be able to hand out some A pluses because there were, and I
Everyone, if
won't,
they get the ring, everyone gets an A plus.
yeah, and I won't look like an ass for overselling or overshooting on someone. I would rather be wrong in a sense that I didn't put too much bank into them rather than being confident in saying that they're a plus player, because it's almost like Dave Portnoy. You don't want to give away a 10 too early.
All right, Portnoy. He's an A plus. All right. Drew Holiday sacrificed the most on this team, and I hear you about being almost over complacent at times. I do, because his sacrifice was so immense, and I think too often he gets a little passive, particularly swinging the ball around to either of the Jays. However, he's the best role player in the league. And it's not remotely close. Not a single player that is a role player like him can turn it on whenever he does. His defense is invaluable. His passing is grossly underrated. I hope, if nothing else, this Joe Mazzulla bag of tricks that he's waiting to unveil for the playoffs, if nothing else, that he whips out the Drew Holiday as the ball more play, because that would be fantastic. Because when he had the ball more in the middle part of that season and he was getting those 8, 9, 10 assist games, it was great to watch. The ball movement was on point. His three-point shooting in particular has really risen from his times early in New Orleans to then when he went to Milwaukee and now, of course, in Boston. He's just a much more confident shooter. He looks more comfortable taking these shots. I agree that he could maybe take a few more, but I think that's something that can allow him on a per matchup basis once you get into the playoffs. Perhaps if they left him maybe open a little bit more, because I think teams might look around the Celtics and point out Drew and say, we need you to beat us.
Right.
And I actually feel minorly comfortable with Drew Holiday doing that. And I understand that a lot of Celtics fans have bad tastes in their mouth because of how Drew got absolutely manhandled in the first round of the playoffs last year against Miami. Despite what people remember, Jimmy Butler was not the guy he was against Milwaukee that he was against Boston. Okay? He just wasn't. Jimmy Butler was the playoff Jimmy against Milwaukee and against Drew Holiday. That's when that happened. And it was really gross to watch because it looked like he just took out Drew's heart and just ripped it out in front of him and laughed in his face. He absolutely dominated him. And it was really concerning from a mentality standpoint when you think of how revered Drew Holiday is, not only as a defender, but as a role guy in this integral part of a team. For that to happen to him, that was definitely tough. But he has backup now. He doesn't have a hurt Giannis as his sidekick this year. He has the Jays. He has Porzingis. He has Derek White. He's in a much better situation. And you can't tell me he doesn't want revenge. He's a competitive dude. So for me, Drew Holiday's an A+ because not only did he sacrifice the most, he still has the ability to turn it on. He's not just this scrub all of a sudden. He's not just this automatic role player. He has the ability, and he does it time and time again. When the Celtics need a basket, he does that Marcus Smart thing, that guard post up, and he does it super well.
Right.
And it always seems to get 2 points. It seems to always work. And if they double him, he makes a great pass out to the perimeter and generates a wide open three. So I feel like his play style is rubbed off on this team in great ways. Maybe it could rub off a little more in some instances, but I think for the most part, this team has really taken the mentality of Drew Holiday, especially on the defensive end. And you can say what you want about this team not having dogs and whatever. Miss me with that. I just want to win basketball games. You can bark at people. You can act all tough. Just win the game. People said that about plenty of teams in history, and guess what? It doesn't matter unless they win the game, okay? So just win the games, and it won't matter who's tough and who's not. But you want to know whose actual toughness is Drew Holiday, and that's why he's an A+ for me. Because he's legit tough. He's not fake tough. He plays the game the right way. He does everything he's supposed to do, and I think for that reason, that will pay dividends come playoff time. Hopefully, we'll see.
Well, before we hop over to the next guy, Here's a stat for you guys. This is
Okay.
something that I've been harping on all year long, and why Drew Holiday is the X factor. The Celtics record when Drew Holiday scores 14 or more points finished the year at 26-1. 26-1. The one
Do you
loss.
have- Oh, you
The
know
one
it?
loss, you might ask, yes, was the Indiana Pacers' terrible last 2-minute report in Indiana, where the Kristaps Porzingis, call on the with Buddy Hield, and then on the other end it was Jaylen Brown. So they should have gone 27-0, undefeated through 27. That's a large sample size. That's a fourth of the NBA year. When Drew Holiday scores 14 or more, that to me, that's why he's the most important, because he's that extra. He's the guy that takes you from fringe championship to championship, like runaway. And for me, when I look at Drew, that's why I had to give it to him. That stat, I was harping on it all year. It wouldn't feel right if I didn't. He was my guy. He was the X factor. As much as I love Porzingis and all those other guys, for me, D White was that man. This next one is weird. Much different role this year, guys, for Al Horford. Much different role. Coming off the bench for the second time in his career. I believe he did it in Oklahoma, but other than that, he has been, starting for 16 years in the league now. So this one was tough. I gave Al a B, because he didn't do anything that jumped off the page, but he was also just so consistent. Like anytime, it feels like Al Horford never makes the wrong play. And to me, when you're at his age, I mean, you could have given him an A and I would have been okay. And quite frankly, you probably could have given him like a B-. And I'm like, yeah, I understand, right? We were arresting him all the time. He was really in this weird spot. I gave him a B. Not too much to it. I think in the playoffs, you're really going to see Al Horford turn back into what Al Horford is about. But right now, Al Horford, you got to go, in my opinion, you got to go B.
I went straight B as well. I think that is a perfect example. Him being able to platoon swap with Porzingis on back-to-back nights was a huge luxury for this Boston Celtics team. He was able to play those longer minute games and have some valuable performances. Much more quiet performances than last year, and that's to be expected at his age, at second oldest player in the NBA. And
Right.
You're not getting, unless it's LeBron James, you're not getting those types of performances from a guy post 35. And I think what he has been able to do is so minimal, and it's almost perfect for him, and it's just conserving him for, especially when playoffs come around. And I can almost guarantee after a strong playoff run, hopefully, I think that we'll have Horford in the A area because it's A for playoff Al.
I think this year, more than any other, Horford was just kind of invisible on the court at times. I think there was a lot of times where I just kind of forgot he was out there. It's not necessarily a problem, just usually he was much more impactful. And even as a guy that his entire role is to do the right thing and shoot threes, shoot timely threes, particularly, and play hard defense, you would just think you would notice him out on the court a little bit more. Maybe that's not fair, especially for his age, but I just feel like for me, you could see the decline coming a little bit more than you have in prior years.
Right.
And I think as well that Horford, they were saving him more than anyone else on this team. And I think in the playoffs, his role will probably expand, like Franco said. And I think he also has the ability to turn it on during certain series because he's such a veteran of the game. He knows when he needs to exert 100% absolute every second of a game and when he can kind of coast a little bit more. And I think we'll see that, especially if Boston somehow matches up with the lowly Milwaukee Bucks at some point in this playoffs where he can guard Giannis for stretches, or even if they play Orlando for some reason and Paolo is such a youth and speed mismatch, but on the low block where Paolo can play at some points, you might see Horford guard him. And I think that kind of versatility is still very valuable to this team. But yeah, I'm fine with a B. I was thinking anywhere between a B and a B minus. I couldn't go much higher. Like I said, he won some games for this team. like once a month. He just kind of has a crazy game, but it's just a little bit too inconsistent at this point to really bump him up any higher than that.
It wasn't necessarily for me that he was playing bad, more so that it was just like, what was he going to do? Like, right? Like, there wasn't really like, there's not a regular season role for Al Horford built into this team. And it just would have felt wrong to give him a C, and it would have felt wrong to give him an A. So I think we all collectively, right, we gave him a B, and it makes sense. Next one, Hauser. And Hauser, if this is my thing with Sam, if you pick out the good Sam Hauser games, he gets an A+. But that's the problem, is you got to pick out the good Sam Hauser games. And again, that's what you're going to get with a guy like Sam. That's, again, he's a spot up, catch and shoot 3-point shooter. You're going to have nights where he's 7 of 8, and you're going to have nights where he's 2 of 8. You know, it's just kind of like what you got to, every great shooter, kind of, that's the thing. Unless you're Steph Curry, right? You really haven't seen much streakiness from Curry, and that's really it if you're a shooter. So he was a huge spark off the bench this year for these guys. And, you know, I think a negative side of it, like I said, was his hit or miss threes. I gave Sam a B. But it was like a fringe B+. So I can't go two ways. I'm going to lean with the B, because like Horford, in a sense, it felt like Hauser was every other game. I bet if you were to scroll through, he'd have 41 great games and 41 and games. And I think for me, when you do that gives you a B. Excited to see what he can do in the playoffs, though. Great, still a great year, but again, it was, you know, better than what we expected, but just it wasn't as consistent.
Right, and I went with a B-, just below you. I think for the same reasons, what made him a higher grade than he was in the years before is the versatility he has gained in his game. He's no longer just that one-trick pony that you can put on the court in shooting scenarios. You can feel trustworthy of him being in for a longer stretch of time on the defensive side. He's no longer a defensive problem. We don't have to worry about teams using him as a mismatch, him being the player that is just an easy blow by. Obviously, he will take his losses here and there, but I think he has developed more into that bench player that he needed to be. And I think we're seeing around where his peak potential is, and when he gains that consistency in his 3-point shot, which is very challenging to do as a 3-point shooter, especially on a team where you're not seeing the longest stretches of minutes and you don't have the most volume opportunity to shoot. It is to be expected, but I think a B- is very fair and a improvement for Sam Hauser.
Yeah, I'm going C+. I think with Sam, my biggest concern, the defense is going back in the wrong direction the last few months of the season. He's getting targeted much more consistently than he was. He was never a good defender, but he was way better than anyone gave him credit for. It was kind of this funny thing where they're like, oh, the light-haired white guy, we're just going to attack him over and over again. And Scal kind of laughed, and he was always like, well, he's going to stand up better than you think. And he kind of did more times than not. And I think recently, again, it's gone wrong, and I don't know necessarily what's gone wrong. I don't know if it's just the fact that the Celtics are so switchable and someone eventually has to get picked on, and that's going to be Sam, and that's just kind of how it is. And the streakiness I can live with. I think the other problem with Sam is he's going cold at the worst time. The Celtics are heading into the playoffs. He's been relatively cold for the last few weeks from beyond the arc, and that's also concerning. I like Sam. I think it's a clear role that can be upgraded for the Celtics, either by hitting on a late first / one of their million second-round picks, or potentially getting one of those like vet minimum guys that's trying to chase a ring. I think it's probably, like I said, the easiest role for the team to upgrade. And for that, I have to give him the lowest grade of anybody. And look, I like what he can do at points off the dribble, but it's still not nearly where like Duncan Robinson transformed himself to, or like where JJ Redick had at points, as these like primarily shooter guys that can also get some for their own at points. He's just not really there yet. It's better. It's definitely better, but it's still not a sizable enough improvement for me. For that, he's a C plus. And look, I like Sam. I think he's a good like 9th, 10th guy. I just feel like his role concerns me a little bit because I don't necessarily trust him that much.
A C plus is low. I will say.
Yeah,
it is low.
I gotcha.
Especially with these next 3 guys coming up. Next one up is, and I want you to guess if you're listening to this, where Xavier goes to school when he gives his grade, because I have a feeling it might impact how high, maybe I'm wrong, but how high he puts Peyton Pritchard, who is the next man up on the chopping block. So for me, here's the thing. It's really easy to get blinded by what Peyton Pritchard has done these past 2 weeks on this report card. But the sucky thing about it is you can't have a barely passing semester and have one test that you do really well on and get an A. And unfortunately, that's the story for Peyton Pritchard, where through 60 games, I did not want to see Peyton Pritchard in the playoff rotation or on the court at all. He was a streaky shooter who could not get it going. He didn't find himself a role in the playmaking category. His defense is only so good for a 6-foot guard, and it felt like he didn't have a spot on this team. Fast forward through the past 20 games, he absolutely has a role on this team. I absolutely trust him in the playoffs, and I'm super excited to see what Pritchard's going to do for us. With that being said, I have to give him a C+, because it felt like the bad so outweighed the good, and the good is just really recent. And as much as I have come to love Peyton Pritchard, and I have all the confidence in the world in Pritchard, unfortunately, there's 82 games in the regular season, and I can't give you anything above a C+ when you only really got it together about 3 weeks ago.
I gave Pritchard a B because I didn't feel comfortable giving him a higher grade than Hauser.
Right.
Or no, I didn't feel comfortable giving Hauser a higher grade than Pritchard because of the pure dominance of what Pritchard has brought from the bench. I mean, the playmaking ability that he has brought to the second team, it started off as just being a spark plug, has developed into something much further, into being the 6th man, unquote. Obviously, Horford's the first man off the bench, but Pritchard's the second guy to come off and lead the team as the ball handler. And I think before the season started, I didn't know how comfortable I was going to feel with him being a primary ball handler off the for the second team, but I think he has developed into that role very well, and I think if he can have those nights where he can decide to be that minimal player and be able to fill the role more than let's say a back-to-back night against the Wizards and Charlotte, I think the performances where we're like, wow, he really stepped up in assists and defense are the ones that bring his grade up more than those 30-point performances, those 20-point performances. So I think just the general growth in his game has brought him up to a B.
Here we go. All right, where do we start with this?
It's like LeBron. Oh boy, where do I begin?
Yeah. Okay. Let's be rational about this. All right. So here's the thing with Pritchard. He stunk, absolutely stunk for the first few months of the season. He was terrible. He was barely playable. He barely looked like an NBA player after getting extended in the offseason. And then, despite what Rob acts like he just had this like great like last 3 weeks, we're gonna pump the brakes a little bit on that. We'll get to that a little bit later. But it was around the turn of the new year he was starting to get the swagger back a little bit more. He had some decent performances in the end of December and the beginning of January, and he was looking a little more comfortable. And then, stuff kind of happened with the rotation. And then in the middle of February, he just turned it on, and he's been kind of that guy ever since. My thing with Pritchard is he was a guy on a team with two really great guards in Drew Holiday and Derek White. And I think Joe Mazzulla struggled to see him have a role early on, and that affected his play style. This is just my opinion. This is not backed by any fact. This is just eye test and what I think I know about basketball. And I think he struggled with that. This is a guy who was an alpha in high school. He won 4 state titles in West Linn. He was an alpha during most of his time here at the University of Oregon. Besides his first year where he took a little bit of a back seat, they made the Final Four. He was Bob Cousy Award winner his senior year. He was all those things. He was the guy on this campus. And then he goes to Boston where they already have this established culture, and he got to play a little bit more his first year in the league because of COVID and whatnot. But he's been primarily asked to kind of take a back seat. And I think after he got paid and he took a further back seat than he even was last year, he's sitting in the complete back of the bus at the beginning of this year. That affected his play. And I think once he started to gain a little bit more trust and carve out a little bit more of a role, you see what happens. And I think with Pritchard, his defense is a concern because of his height. He's pesty. He's great at hounding on ball, but how much can he do? He's 6 foot tall. And I think with Pritchard, the thing I've noticed the most is that confidence that I saw watching him as a senior in Oregon has finally come back. It's not just this little swagger he showed in spurts. It's permanently there. It's completely back. He thinks he's that guy. And I don't care if it's against the Wizards on a second night of a back-to-back or if it's playing actual minutes against Miami or whatever. He thinks he's that guy. And I think this team needs someone who thinks they're that guy because we talked about it earlier. Sometimes some of these guys are a little too complacent for their own good. And sometimes they don't just have that extra mentality, that extra gear, that grit that they have. And I think Pritchard exuberates that night in and night out, especially now that he's kind of gotten his stuff together here. And it's not just against the bad teams. He's been doing it against everybody as of the last, 2 months or so. Right. And this could be a little bit too high, but I'm giving him a B+. I'm giving him a B+ because I think he went from a guy who I barely wanted to see on the floor to a guy that I think is crucial now in the playoffs. And I don't think you get to that unless you have a B+ season. And the reason I have him so much ahead of Hauser, which might have been
that was my question, right?
The reason I have him so much ahead of Hauser is because what Pritchard does beyond just score is so much more valuable because Hauser is also a liability on defense, just like Pritchard. But I think you can hide Pritchard a little more because it's just naturally easier to hide a guard more on defense than it is as a forward. And when Hauser isn't shooting well from beyond the arc, let's face it, he's kind of useless. What else does he do? Pritchard is a underrated passer. He can dribble, obviously, very well. He can create his own shot. I just feel like what he does well exceeds what Hauser does well. And Hauser's weapon, when he's on, when he's at 45% from deep, that is such an invaluable thing to have on this specific team. This team that is so gung-ho on shucking three-pointers. And I truly understand that. But I feel like Hauser, especially the last few months, has been far more inconsistent than anyone cares to admit. And I understand why, because everyone has that fear about Hauser and Pritchard, that if they're called upon in the playoffs, they might not be able to get it done. But in my personal opinion, I trust Pritchard a little bit more to at least do the other things right than Hauser, who, again, Franco said he's not really one-trick pony. I kind of disagree. I really think he still is.
Well, let me ask you this. If you were to tally up all the games, right? Because I guess this really isn't as much as it, this isn't what you can do. It's what you did for us.
Right.
And so you still think, because a whole letter grade, that's a big jump. That's not like so if you think if you were to put all of those games and you look at the season in a vacuum between you think Pritchard really had a whole letter grade higher than do you think maybe it's your grade for Hauser's a little low versus your grade for Pritchard, or are you set in stone? Because you haven't been a Hauser guy, and I know that.
Yeah, I'll let you into the grading system a little bit here. I value the beginning of the season a little bit less than I do the last few months. And it's tricky for the Celtics team because of how far ahead they are and how much these games haven't mattered. And the beginning of the season is when Pritchard just absolutely stunk. So that matters a little bit less to me than where Hauser's been since, January, for example. And the reason why I'm so low on Hauser is because I just see these guys all the time. And I feel like if Hauser's on I don't know, not even a terrible team, because every time someone does this comparison, they choose Charlotte, and you're like, okay, everyone's gonna be terrible in Charlotte.
Right.
But even if he's on a team like Cleveland, are you really getting that excited about Sam Hauser? I understand why Boston fans do, because Boston's 64-18 or whatever, and they're the best team in the league and the title favorite. He's gonna be playing probably in the playoffs here. But if he's on a team like Cleveland, he's not even a mention. He's not even a guy you remotely get excited about. And I just feel like if the three's not falling, he's at the point where I don't know what else he does. I really don't, because his passing has never really improved from his time at Marquette or Virginia till now. And at least Pritchard gives me other things. And I think that's why maybe a whole letter grade's a little much. Maybe Pritchard's closer to a B. But I think the confidence thing and the ability to kind of get a whole crowd going, I can bump you up a little bit and give you the plus there. Because Pritchard has that ability. Because whether you want to say it's because he's a short white guy or whether you want to say it's his own moxie, he gets the crowd going. There's not a whole lot of guys on the bench of this team that gets the whole crowd going like Pritchard. And I feel like that's one of those things that it gets you a little bit better of mark for me. It's more about Pritchard just doing the extra things than where I am with Hauser. And again, like you mentioned, that I've been pretty consistent about this Hauser thing. I don't trust him. I don't love the game plan of you're just going to come in and shoot 10 threes and we're going to just absolutely pray 4 of them fall in because then we're unbeatable. And I just wish I saw a little bit more of him. Do you remember the beginning of the season? He was doing all these like backdoor cuts and he shot a little bit more off the dribble. Just kind of went away from that. And I wish it kind of was a little more prevalent here.
I mean, I think that is a fair point. However, I think you may have forgotten how bad Pritchard was through 41 games.
He was awful. He was terrible.
Right.
I remember. He was the main guy for the first like 2-3 months of the season.
Yeah. But all right, I that's a fair point. You delivered me some things I can get behind. But something you did say is gets the crowd going. And this next guy is the king of getting. And I'm going to say this right here. This was the biggest Robbie's wrong of the year, and it is Luke Cornett. I was so wrong, and I gave it an A+. I gave Luke Cornett an A+ on this report card because I went from
the gym teacher.
I went from thinking this guy didn't belong on the court to what he never messed up. He was always making the right play. He was a great on the pick and roll. He was a great diver. He did everything he asked you to do. What his contract is it's just for me to go mentally from I don't think you belong on the court to I can see you as a comfortable second string big man right now through the regular season, right? Not in the playoffs, but for me to get so comfortable with Luke in where his expectations were and where I thought he was going to end up and where I thought he should have been, it was an A+. And it's a little high. I get that, but when he would get off the bench in the first 20 games of the year, I would say out loud, what the hell are we doing? Why is he checking into the game? I still think the double big is really wacky. When he checks in with Kristaps, I still don't like that. I don't think you're going to see it in the playoffs because I think this rotation really gets cut down. But when you put Luke Cornett and you look at what he did, it's got to be an A+. I mean, and I'm sorry, but that dude just blew my expectations out of the water and shut me the hell up because I was so wrong.
Yeah, I thought I was being real generous here with a C+.
I got to go A+. I'm sorry, but I have to.
I mean, don't get me wrong. What he has done has been above his expectations going into this season.
A+,
I will.
A+.
I will. I wouldn't cry if Cornette came in to give Porzingis and Horford some rest. I think Tillman's going to step in more as that third center. But as an energy guy and a leadership, or not leadership, locker room presence, I think that he does such a great job with this team. And I think when he gets into the game, it, as you said, gets the team ecstatic. Almost any single movement he makes, it gets people to react off the bench, and they're laughing at him or with him while he's on the court. But I think that there are still holes in his game. Obviously, he's still not the most skilled player on the court at most points. but as a player that gets the job done, I think a C plus. That's like a 77. I think is a fair assessment grade.
Before you go, Xavier, real quick, Franco, I just want to ask you this one quick question: yes or no? Do you think Luke Cornett could have given you anything more this year?
Could have given me any more this year? Of course. No, I don't believe so. But
A plus then.
That's where I asked you about my grading scale before the show. I was like, are we going off of what? Are we going off of individual scoring, or are we going off of? I am going off the basketball grade book, basically almost 2K overall type grading.
Right.
Can't even get this one out. Look, Luke Cornett, I'm sure, is a great guy. By all accounts, everyone likes him. The fans like him. The teammates like him. It's awesome. And he really did improve this season. Low bar, to be fair, because at plenty of points he looked awfully uncoordinated and had no business being on the basketball court. This year he looked, he could play some minutes.
Perfect.
I think there was like a solid month. He was really awesome. Like he was really like exceeding expectations. We're like, oh my God, Luke Cornett, are you seeing this? Are you seeing what Luke's doing out there? But that's kind of all it was. It was a month. And even now he kind of fell out of the rotation the last like few months of the season. He was playing far less than he was towards that middle chunk. And look, Luke's a great guy, like I said, and everyone talks so highly of him. And I understand the fan dynamic with him. He's just kind of goofy and it's funny and he's in on the joke. So
perfect
it's cool.
Scout roll.
But this isn't a charity case. We're not running Red Cross here. I'm not just giving out grades because you're a nice guy and you get the fans going and whatnot. It doesn't work like that. I'm giving him a B minus. It feels high to me. Feels like I'm almost being too nice. Honestly, I'd go lower. If I could in my heart, I can only go so low on Luke here. He is a free agent at the end of the season. I believe Bleacher Report had him going to Memphis for whatever that's worth. But he's a guy that I would not lose a single night's sleep over if they lost, and they could easily replicate his production or improve it. So for that, I have to give you a B minus because you did what you had to do. You're a good part of the team. You're good for morale, but come on, what are we doing?
That's all fair. To each his own, you know what I'm saying? But Luke Cornett A plus. Come on, man. We got one more guy here, and this is the star of the show, in my opinion. This is what everyone is waiting for, and it's not a player, man. And this is Joe Mazzulla, and this one is where I think it gets messy. It's tough. It's so when you talk about like when I looked at I have all these players' names and I have all my little notes and I have all my grades right next to them. Joe Mazzulla was probably the one where I genuinely had no clue what to do. Because there were games where the Celtics looked awesome and you figured, all right, this got to be Joe. Like he's the head coach. And then there was games where the Celtics looked terrible and you're like, all right, this is Joe. I will say I have a positive and a negative for every player. Some players have 3 positives and no negatives. Some players have 1 positive and 3 negatives. I have 1 positive and 1 negative for Joe. And really, I could totally get deeper into it. And there's much more positives and more negatives than these 2 I'm going to give you. But I think this is where my thought process is at to kind of break it down for you guys. The positive, the Celtics won 64 games. That's the positive. The first 60-win season since the 08-09 season. Mind you, the head coach of that was Doc Rivers, look where he is now and what he did post Boston Celtics era. My negative is kind of 2. Its timeouts were costly at times because they were right. I mean, as much as hate him or love him, you got to admit that his timeouts were costly. In the late game execution, he was god awful. In the last minute of the game, there was no execution at all at any point of the year. Other than that Minnesota game is really the one time I can think about, like when we were down and we were coming back and players made big shots and it wasn't coaching. It was a missed free throw ball rotation into standing wide open Drew Holiday in the corner with the shot. This is so tough because it felt like I gave him an A minus and It's high in my opinion. It was really high.
Very.
Because I think Joe Mazzulla the bad, in my opinion, outweighed the good, which is crazy on a 64-win team. But I was a guy with Joe Mazzulla who was very critical of him. I will give him credit. They won 64 games. Their offensive numbers and defensive numbers were off the charts this year, and you got to at least reward him for that. I think if he can clean up the timeouts, which he has at times, and if he can get the late game execution down, which I think really at this point of the year we're screwed, and we have to hope and pray that our players make the shots, which again, cross our fingers that they do. A- feels high for Joe, but at the same time, he has done a lot was good this year, and it wouldn't be fair to Joe Mazzulla. And I can understand this, and I think I can call myself out on this to give him really anything below. I mean, I think you go a little bit more below an A-, but it wouldn't be fair. I think I'd be nitpicking a little too much.
Yeah, I went with a B- for Joe Mazzulla.
Okay.
Stop the press.
So I think what he was able to do this season, I am a very big Joe Mazzulla supporter. I think that he is a great leader. But never will we ever say that that game was a great scheme by Joe Mazzulla. Wow, how did you come up with that defensive lineup? Wow, how did you come up with that play? We didn't expect that to happen to get yourselves back into that one. I think what he has to do is pretty much a lot of cruise control work, and I think this is a great place for him to develop into the coach that he will be. I think with the time and experience, he will develop into a coach that you can have around on a team for a few years. Winning a championship this year will definitely help his odds, and when you get a championship on your resume as a head coach, obviously you're now a respected head coach, and he will get his flowers, and people will almost kind of think more of him than he is right now. I think I don't know if we're going to dive into him that much, but I think the assistant coaches had a lot to do with where Missoula has improved in his game, and we've started to see him pick up those head coaching tendencies. And even later into the season, we started to see those timeouts improve. We're still waiting on that late game situations to improve as well, and it's not a great thing to be going into playoffs still having questions on if you think this team can close out a close game in the final 2 minutes if they're down by 3 or 4. But I think that was due to mainly them not being in that situation nearly at all this season. When a loss was a loss, you kind of knew it. And I just think that Joe Mazzulla can take credit for keeping this. He can have credit for getting this team to where they're expected to be. If they were anywhere below this, I think if they were, let's say, in the conversation with they were just finishing off the season in a dogfight with the Bucks, Knicks, all trying to get that number 1 seed, and let's say they were in that pack, I think that Joe Mazzulla might have been out the door. But I think that he was able to hold the fort together enough to get through, and I think that his leadership abilities can win this team a championship.
Yeah, Franco is such a big fan of the guy. I give him a B- and slammed him for 5 minutes. This was my toughest grade. If you're a half decent businessman, it's probably not the hardest thing in the world to run Apple. It runs itself, right? And that's kind of how I think of Joe Mazzulla. You don't have to be the best coach in the world to coach this team, but you don't also have to be the most competent one either. Kind of runs itself with the talent. It's the talent on this team is so much superior than every single other team in the league from just top to bottom roster wise that you don't need the greatest schemes and you don't need all that. But at the same time, you shouldn't be a reason why so many people think you're losing the game as well. And I
Right.
think that's where Joe Mazzulla falls into. I'm going to give him a B because I feel like it takes credit, and I really struggled with B or B plus. I think it takes credit to manage all these egos. I don't think that's the easiest thing in the world. And I think, in a way, a lot of these players respect him. For that alone, you have to be at least in the B territory.
Right.
Because we've seen this go sideways plenty of times, particularly in basketball, where your face is always visible when you're watching the game. You're always like a brand off the court as well. And to manage everything that goes around that is impressive. And it takes a really special guy to do that. And Joe Mazzulla has clearly been able to do that. The timeout thing I won't do. I won't go into it, but we know it exists and we know how stupid and awful it is. I think schematically, I don't think Franco's given him enough credit. I think often this team does run some really nice sets and does impress me with that. I think more so than anything else, it's the constant philosophy that we are doing something that is so much better than everyone else thinks, and it's going to be this big secret, and just wait for it to come, and we promise it's going to happen. It feels like that there's always this thing with the Celtics where, like, okay, the threes aren't falling, but watch, they're about to, right? Just watch. Law of averages, they're about to fall in this game. Don't worry about it. Doesn't matter that the lane's wide open and we can be taking layups. Just watch. This brand of basketball is going to work in this specific game. There's so many instances this year where the Celtics have lost games truly because they shot terrible from three and haven't adjusted. And to me, that's inexcusable. To me, with this team, it's inexcusable that you never have a plan B. And I feel like so often with Joe Mazzulla, there's never a plan B. And I think a lot of these warts on this team, he chalks up, and it's the joke I say over and over again, and I'm sure listeners are getting tired of it at this point. It's the wait till the playoffs. Just wait, guys. Hey, it's in the bag. You want Drew to have the ball more. You want Kristaps to be around the basket more. You want Tatum to be in pick and roll a little bit more and go to the basket. Just wait. It's coming, guys.
Right.
Coming to the playoffs. And if it doesn't come, not only does he look like a fraud, and not only is it annoying, it's probably going to cost the team a title. And so at this point, Joe Mazzulla, to me, more than any single player on this team, is a wait and see. And the reason I say that is I kind of have the realm of an idea of what I'm getting from Jason Tatum and Derek White and Drew Holiday. The guys I'm a little unsure about, Jaylen Brown, you know, remember how to dribble in the playoffs like you forgot how to do last year. Kristaps are going to be around the basket. But Joe Mazzulla, my goodness, talk about a legacy shifter. If they win the title, I don't know if I can ever complain about a timeout again, even if it's warranted. It's one of those things. No matter if the criticism is warranted, fears because they have the title. That's what happens. Right?
The ring shuts everyone. I mean, look at Doc Rivers. I mean, just look at Doc Rivers.
Think about how long it took Doc Rivers to get on the side of that one ring is your meal ticket, though. Think about how long that took him.
I know, and if people had any eyes. Yeah, and if you had any eyes, you were able to tell back with those Clippers teams. He didn't have, and I mean, let's throw it back to, and I know we're getting off of real quick about Doc Rivers.
Okay.
If you remember 2012, Celtics were up 3-2 against Miami, man, and the Eastern Conference. It's game 6 at home, and the Celtics collapsed. So I hate to trash on Joe Mazzulla, but to me, to finish off this episode, Joe Mazzulla doesn't win you a game, but he can lose you a game. And as a head coach, it can't be like that. I think Joe Maz is way too analytical. I think he does a terrible job at looking at what's in front of you and adjusting. I will say, I think the guys behind him do a phenomenal job at looking what's going on and adjusting, and I think that's helped this. And I think Joe Mazzulla is starting to learn. However, my problem with this is that we're currently in the biggest Celtics run of probably of our lifetimes, and our head coach is learning and developing, and when you talk about Joe Mazzulla, that's what scares me, and that's unacceptable. And again, it's not his fault; it's the management's fault. It's Wick Grossbeck and Brad Stevens. You ask me, Brad's had a phenomenal tenure here. The first thing he's ever done is hire Joe Mazzulla, and again, he's the head coach to a 64-win team. So.
And that's the thing, though. That was an impossible situation because they didn't know the stuff with the EMA was going to be how it was. And to be honest, whatever people's opinion on that is, they didn't have a choice. It's policy. It is what it is. Whether you think it's a big deal or not doesn't really matter because guess what? Jaywalking is against the law in some places, and you can still get written up or ticketed for it and whatever. And I think the problem with Joe Maz is There's no one else to hire. And I feel like for me, there was always a point where I was like, okay, either go off the board with like a Frank Vogel, call Jay Wright on the beach somewhere, see if he wants to coach the NBA, or wait a little bit and get Quinn Snyder, who you knew was going to be out of that Utah job. And I understand because of the personnel on this team why they didn't want to do that. They were just coming off the finals, and they have to hire a new head coach. And they had the chance to cut bait with Joe last year. But, and here's the issue with the whole Joe Mazzulla thing. It comes down to this one critical point. Boston came back from 3-0 down, and the reason they primarily lost Game 7 is because Jason Tatum twisted his ankle in the first 15 seconds of that game.
Right.
If Jason Tatum didn't do that and they lost, I think Joe Mazzulla might have been fired. And if Boston didn't force the Game 7 and perhaps lost in 5 or 6, I think Joe Mazzulla would have been fired. That critical moment was an out for ownership and management, and I know why they did it. Because who's the GM of this team? Brad Stevens. What did he do for a very long time at a very high level? Coach basketball. He understands the pain that Joe Mazzulla is going through. And I think Wick Grossbeck and the ownership group really trust Brad Stevens, and they should, because that man is an absolute genius. And the only reason he wasn't a little bit more successful as an NBA head coach is because of his personality. Just an atypical guy, and he's a little shy, and he probably doesn't have that, ferociousness that you might need with an NBA coach in 2024. And he wasn't a former player as well at a high level. Like Joe Maz, at least, was a great player at West Virginia. He was a great glue guy anyway. And the problem now that we're seeing is that decision from that moment is going to be this domino effect in a good way or a bad way. It's going to be they did the right thing. They stood by their guy. They understand he was a little underqualified and he had to learn on the job. But guess what? He just delivered them at a title. He's clearly – his philosophy is taking over the game. It's sweeping by. And I think some of his philosophy has merit. I'm not going to act like this guy is just a total dipwad. But at the same time, if they don't win the title, who's going to be the first guy everyone blames? Jason Tatum. And then the second guy will be Joe Mazzulla. And that is where the problems start. Because now, if you fire Joe Mazzulla after this season, if things go wrong, you have what? It's like the fourth head coach in 5 years or something ridiculous. And then you start to anger the Jays. And then you start to anger the nucleus of this team. And then things get messy. And that's where the problems go. But I don't want to think about that because I think, like Rob mentioned, this team has 64 wins for a reason.
Right.
No team with an identical resume has lost the NBA Finals. None of them. Not a single one. So go out there and do what you're supposed to do and win the title.
Right. And I think that's why I gave Joe Mazzulla a high score, because as much as you want to harp on him, I think it's easy to harp when you're winning so much. The losses are way more bright and the losses are way more, out there. So again, it's an exciting time. I love the report card episode because of it means the playoffs are approaching. And guys, we are going to have a whole week just chock full of content for you guys dropping every single day, starting with this one. We got a bunch of stuff. So if you're not already following us on all of our social medias, they're right down below. There's going to be a bunch of content coming your way. And if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, guys, which is hopefully where you're watching this, if you're listening on Spotify, go head over to YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube channel, turn on those post notifications, guys, because again, so much content coming this week. It's an exciting time for the Celtics fans, for NBA fans, guys. I'm Rob. Like I said, next to me is my man, Nick Franco, and over across is the man, Xavier, the X-Man, guys. Until next time, we will see you, and go Celtics.